Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I'm joined by Hugo.
Hello.
And I'm Josh, and we're going to talk to you today about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and whether we think they are good or bad. And we're going to break each one of them down.
Yeah, so this is something that is colloquially known as Agenda 2030, or it's more officially known as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, right? And the Sustainable Development Goals are kind of part of it. They're the central part of the 2030 Agenda. And so because the 2030 Agenda is something that is quite often cited as something like opaque and nefarious, as something like hidden, like we wanted to kind of go through it and see what it is, because it's not actually hidden. It's actually something very public and very kind of worldwide spread, and like it's something that is out there, and that its aim is to be out there as much as possible. Its aim is to be kind of known worldwide and adopted worldwide, and its advocacy. And so that's its point. It's not something done in secret or anything like that. It's the opposite of that.
And I take it the 2030 refers to the year 2030
Exactly.
when they want these goals to be achieved.
Exactly. And so before we go kind of deep into what that is and what the goals are, I'm going to just say a little bit of a background about the UN and what it is, how it works, so that we have the kind of context to place that in. And so the UN has sometimes being described as a monster bureaucracy, right? Because it's enormous. I mean, it's huge. And like, see, if you look at kind of some of the charts and like bubble charts and everything, how it looks and what it all includes, it's massive. And I think you can't believe what is all there when you look at it for the first time. It's unbelievable. But yeah, it has a lot of branches, a lot of things, a lot of agencies that it includes, a lot of things that it does. The most important thing in it is the Security Council, which is something that it's a household name, and what it does is kind of preside over world peace and security issues and war and stuff like that. And of course, it's not a state. It doesn't have any kind of it's not structured like a state. It's a consort of state. A couple of states have a permanent seat at the Security Council, and then a couple of other states are rotating, and yeah, they can make resolutions, and their resolutions are binding, which means states have to follow it under international law, right? And there's some penalties if they don't, or it's a bigger deal, right? That, and then apart from the Security Council, apart from the war, peace, security stuff, there is the General Assembly, and that deals with basically everything. You have the same issues voted on and discussed there as well, but in a slightly different capacity, and kind of like, well, what does this mean? What do we want? What does each state want? And but also it goes beyond those, beyond the security and war stuff. It goes into like humanitarian stuff and economic and development and things like that. And that's the main point behind the General Assembly, and not just having the Security Council, is that whatever you want to kind of discuss among states, you go there and you do that. And it's a forum. It's a place to voice the opinion of your state, and bicker with the others about what you're going to do and what you think the others should and shouldn't do.
Yeah, generally I know it as the place where states complain about other states.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much all I've seen from
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
And so the resolutions from the General Assembly are not binding. They're not the international law in the strict sense, but I'm going to get back to it at the end and to kind of explain a little bit what that means, because even though it's not binding, it doesn't mean everyone can just ignore it. That's not how it works, especially in this sphere of international relations, where the enforcement often falls back onto the states that are part of the club, and is not something above them, right? And so the fact that that the resolutions are non-binding doesn't mean that it's weak, or that it doesn't exist, or it's whatever, right? And so this specific thing that we're going to focus on is part of the UNDESA, which is the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And the main point of this department is basically, well, we're going to look at some goals. We'll set ourselves some goals and socioeconomic goals, and then we'll take a look at states, at areas, whatever, and we'll see where someone is falling behind these goals. And if we see someone is kind of not progressing enough, or not having good results, well, then we can kind of mobilize around that. We can get kind of money flowing towards that. We can get people talking about it and everything like that.
So it's a bit more supportive than punitive. It's not necessarily saying, okay, you've deviated from these goals, we're going to do something
Yeah.
to punish you. They just try and help a state along with
Yeah.
achieving their goals.
Well, often it's tied to whether it's seen as something that the state did on its own, kind of intentionally or not. You've got some states which are basically designed as rogue states, which means that, well, they do stuff that we don't like, and therefore we're not going to cooperate with them, and they outside the normal system. And so those are, for example, like North Korea, right? It's the quintessential example. Not cooperating, everyone basically sees it as a state, but and it is a state, objectively speaking. Like I'm sure no one's going to dispute that, but at the same time, it's a state that doesn't do what the other states usually do at the UN and what they agree on. Like it does other things, and so it's kind of outside this orbit. So if something bad happens in North Korea, it's not like there's going to be a lot of aid going to it, a lot of like consultation of how to solve the problem and things like that, because everyone knows, well, they did it on purpose, right? And they have kind of nefarious goals behind it, which is something that I think should be maybe assumed with a lot more states rather than just the rogue states. But well, then again, the UN is an interstate club, is not a club of like international like citizens from countries that are kind of solving their problems. It's a states club, right? And so it makes sense that states that see themselves as good wouldn't kind of shine the light on themselves on what they might be doing bad.
Yeah, and it strikes me a little bit there that if one of the states that is supposedly going along with this, even if they did do something which impacted their progress towards these goals, it is probably the nature of the thing that it would be very difficult for them to prove that it was their action in the first place that had done it, and therefore I would imagine that this wouldn't necessarily come up as much. I know I'm getting into a bit of a tangent there.
No, exactly, but that's a good point, because a lot of these goals are goals like for the state to kind of enact some kind of policies, which implies that the policies that are in place now are not conducive to those goals. And so that means the states are basically doing it, right? The states are doing it so that the goals are not reached and not being reached if they're not being. And so, well, the point is then it's always the states doing or not doing what they're supposed to be doing. The point, I think, more is to see that it might be intentional or not intentional, right? And so if there's something going on that's bad somewhere, well, then the UN will come together and will say, well, is it the government being criminal, or is it some kind of catastrophe that the government tries to solve but weren't successful? Maybe they implemented a bad approach in good faith or something like that, but it's not something that we can really blame them for, because that wasn't the point of why they did it, right? And so I think that's the main difference. But yeah, generally most countries are within that kind of same orbit, on the same boat, let's say, and they would all kind of at least pretend to follow the same rules and the same values behind all of this. And so then they would be part of that kind of help or assistance or mobilization of resources whenever something happens. And so that's kind of like a mutual insurance like that. So it pays off in a lot of ways to pretend as a state that you value those things that the most powerful states value, even if you don't really do that. If you do that, well, good for you either way, if you value it anyway.
I find it very unusual that there's such a large organisation that is pushing policies which, to me, given how politically diverse the entire world is, it would be very surprising that everyone would agree on these policies. So having to adhere to them seems a little bit unusual, to kind of put it euphemistically.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and that's also what is quite weird about that all countries supposedly agree on it. And I'm gonna get to it at the end as well, to this point of all countries supposedly agreeing to it, and this being a collective effort of all states supposedly. But I just wanted to say, before we actually get into the 2030 agenda and the goals, that here we want to go over the goals themselves and to see what their values are, what they're aiming at. We're not necessarily looking at what they're doing to implement it, because that's a whole another kind of worms that we don't want to open here, because it would take ages, and like that's a separate issue of whether it works, to what extent, and whether the UN is actually able to do something about solving those problems and reaching those goals, or to what extent it's just observing something that is happening regardless of what it does or doesn't do.
I could imagine going through the finer points of kind of policy would probably be very kind of slow and tedious work as well, and just a huge mess of different things.
Exactly. And so, I mean, there are so on their website it says that there are 17 goals, which we go over, 167 targets, which some of them we will go over, but there's 3,054 events, 1,299 publications, and 5,428 actions. And so that's massive numbers. Those are massive numbers of things that are actually happening in connections to those goals, right? And so this is something that is huge, and that we can't just go over all the details and all the documents that come out of all those actions, because it's massive. Even the documents that we're going to look at, the kind of founding document of all of it, is very long. So I've only picked the actual goals to look at, and not the text that is around it, setting out kind of the fluff around it, and the goals and the values and everything. So it's worth reading some of them, because it gives you a sense of what it's like and what kind of the sentiment is. But it's absolutely not worth reading all of them, because they're all the same. So there's no point.
So I think it's important, before we actually get into the agenda itself, to set out why it's important. And I think from the impression that I've got here, it seems to me that this is something that is going to be framing the kind of sustainability and development of the entire world. So obviously you don't really need to understand much beyond that, because that kind of speaks for itself. But of course it's going to be informing public policy in whatever country you're in, probably.
Yep.
So you need to understand how and why it might be influencing, and hopefully through identifying these 17 different goals, you may be able to see, well, this seems to be coming from the UN if you're looking at policy in your own country.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.